Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Sensory Science Group webinar, Strategies for Implementing AI and Machine Learning Techniques. My name is Stephanie Mitchell. I am the chair of the IFST Sensory Science Special Interest Group. This group allows members interested in sensory science to engage and share knowledge with fellow professionals. We cover a wide range of topics relating to the sensory properties of food and drink, including sensory testing and analysis, consumer trends, neuroscience, the impact of social networking, and health and wellness. We're also involved in accreditation and examination of sensory training and the review and promotion of ethical and professional standards. This webinar is the third in a series, replacing our planned June conference, which has been cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Please keep an eye on the IFST's events page for more details of the next webinar. Feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation where we will respond to as many of these questions as possible, and Sarah Bilson, a member of the Sensory Science Group Committee, will ask these questions. Our speaker today is Daniel Protz. He is the founder and CEO of FlavorWiki, a digital company dedicated to combining consumer engagement with advanced data and machine learning techniques to map drivers of preference in food and beverage products. For more information on his biography, please look on the IFST website. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that nice introduction. Well, everyone, I want to thank you for being here today with us, and we're looking forward to sharing with you some of our experiences. At FlavorWiki, where I'm the CEO, we have had a lot of experience implementing different AI and machine learning techniques throughout the food industry. So we've got a short agenda for you today here, which is going to outline like the following. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about what is changing in the food industry and why digital and AI techniques are becoming more and more important. I will spend a few minutes talking about FlavorWiki and how our experience has fit into that. We'll then spend a little bit of time discussing what are the adoption challenges for digital and AI in the food industry, and how is the food industry specifically unique in some ways versus others for that problem. And then we'll go into some strategies and steps that you could potentially use in your organization for deploying digital and AI techniques. So, why is this important? Why should digital and AI be important now in the industry or in this point in history versus others? Well, as it happens, if you look at almost every category of retail, of which food is a category, so we are retailers of food in the end, these categories have been significantly impacted by digital transformation over the past 20 to 25 years. So starting with Amazon back in 1994, started to have a situation where products and services could be purchased in a different way. So traditionally, throughout history, you had to go to a physical location, to a store, in order to purchase products. But now that we have online tools, you see that more and more categories are migrating towards being sold online. So at first it was digital things such as books, information, and now in the past couple of years you've had the transition to apparel and health and beauty, and now food is becoming much more frequently sold online, not only in the grocery space, but also in the delivery space. And if you just look back 25 years, so it used to be the case that no books were sold online, but today, in 2020, 55% of books are sold online, and in apparel, it's 39%. So while these transformations may seem slow over the course of 1 to 2 years, looking over the course of 1 to 2 decades, actually they can be quite significant. And in the food space, this acceleration towards going online in grocery and online delivery has been hastened by the COVID crisis, and I think that you're going to see more and more discussion and more transformation in that direction. I always like to share one quote that I have from a discussion I had with a chairman of a major food company, and that is, he said that, for 70 years, the company has been optimized to put food on the shelf in just a few store chains. But in 10 years from now, food delivery and meal kits will be a bigger part of that business. So you see that actually the change from physical retail to digital retail is really driving a lot of change in the industry, and the entire supply chain will need to react to that. So where does FlavorWiki fit in with all of this? At FlavorWiki, we've built a digital application, and we are a completely digital company. We don't produce any food. But this digital application is meant to collect information that is helpful for food producers by connecting food producers to their customers in an interesting way focused around the topic of taste and flavor. And this topic of taste and flavor is a critical one when it comes to food because it is the largest driver of repeat purchase and purchase intent in the category. At FlavorWiki, we offer a range of services. The first is that we have a self-service platform, which is a SaaS software, and this includes access to an AI and machine learning sensory tool that we have that can collect individual sensoric profiles from consumers, but also can aggregate these to form accurate sensory profiles of different products using a crowd approach. We also have a global community of consumers around the world that we engage in a pretty unique way that I'll explain in a moment. And then finally, we are what we call a digital partner to our customers in that we help them to leverage the unique features of the taste experience that we're creating with our software for use in marketing, consumer understanding, and different areas of their business as they migrate towards being more digital. So as I mentioned, FlavorWiki has a very unique way of engaging the users that we have around the world to talk about food and to describe what they're eating or drinking. And we call this a tasting experience. So what happens is consumers will go out into the world, they'll purchase products which we ask them to buy. They might do this with products they have in their home or that they're just consuming in their everyday life. And they describe that product using a unique binary paired question that is driven by a machine learning algorithm. And this allows us to map their personal perceptive situation, but also understand different products that they like or prefer more. And from this, we can create a fingerprint of what is their tasting profile. What do they like? What are things that are driving their preferences from a very nuanced sensoric point of view? Of course, we aggregate this information for use in market research, but the other thing that we do with that is drive a purchase and discovery experience for them in stores, with meal kit delivery and takeout. And so the consumer is actually, rather than trading their feedback for a monetary gain, which is something we believe actually creates a lot of distortion in the industry and in the feedback that many research platforms are getting, but they're actually trading this for a consumption and discovery experience. And the more, of course, they give us information, the more, of course, we can drive that experience for them. Typical situations which we engage in are things like market mappings and product testings for consumption experience or benchmarking, where the consumer will go out into the store or they'll buy something online, they'll review it, they can share these profiles with their friends. We get a lot of our consumer engagement and community from sharing. They get products recommended to them from various portfolios of products that we have and understand, and then we aggregate this to give manufacturers insights about the market. It is possible that we also sometimes ship prototypes. For the most part, we're mapping in-market products that are out in the world, and this can include packaged goods, but also can include QSR menu items or even recipes that are cooked in home. We also have a tool for doing consumer engagement on packaging. So it's very simple to engage consumers on the point of purchase using a QR code where we can get feedback about the product, but also about the purchase experience, the price, where it was placed, how easy was it to find, etc. And then all of these insights are gathered in real time so they can be accessed by the client as it's happening. And you can really understand what consumers are doing all the time throughout the purchase experience, throughout their day, over months and years. And finally, we do offer a service which is more or less a marketing platform. So either post-launch or simply promoting products to our own consumer users, but also in optimizing the marketing funnel so that we can target consumers based on their likelihood of repeat purchase or their likelihood of liking the product from a sensoric point of view, which, as I mentioned before, is a critical factor in purchase intent and repeat purchase. The output that we generate, and this is an important point which we'll touch on later, is very similar to the existing output that the companies we work with are used to seeing when they do consumer testing. So we can work anywhere in the world. We've operated in 12 countries. We're available in 15 languages now. But we really focus on working with our customers so that we deliver to them output and data which is in a format and presented in a way that is immediately actionable inside their organization. So we do a lot of customization of our reporting. The data, of course, is quite similar to, from case to case. All the data is proprietary to the client, but we do spend a lot of time in customizing reporting and output because we think this is important for increasing adoption internally at the client level. Okay, so how does all of this apply to the digital journey that your company might be on? As I mentioned, we've worked with a number of companies implementing our software and implementing our services. This includes ingredient companies, flavor companies. So we do work with suppliers in several different ways. We also work with a lot of packaged goods suppliers that are, basically dealing with packaged goods products that they're selling globally around the world. And then we have also worked with QSR restaurants, meal kit delivery companies, etc. So throughout the value chain, and we've noticed some things on the part of the client partner and on our part that have been successful, and some things which have not been successful in terms of how to integrate and walk down the journey of bringing a new technique into your company. And so we just want to share some of those. The first is there is an AI adoption challenge, shall we say. And AI, I think in this context and in general, is used a bit too loosely. So artificial intelligence in general has to do with simply the processing of large amounts of data and finding associated relationships between that, using what is now a much greater amount of computing power that we have today versus 10 years ago. You'll hear, I think, the terms AI, machine learning, even digitalization used interchangeably, oftentimes incorrectly. But nevertheless, there is a general adoption challenge that we've found when it comes to these new types of techniques. And here are some of the reasons why we have noticed them, and therefore it's important to look out for them. So the first thing is that digitization in general in the world is increasing the pace of change much more than has been seen in the previous decades. So the difference between how we operate as a society, how our retail space operates, is more different now than it was 20 years ago, than the differences probably between 1990 and 50 years before that. So the pace of change is increasing dramatically, yet the industries that we deal with are more or less the same. They were built up over time and they have structures that are ingrained and, in many cases, old habits die hard for good reasons. The thing that is well true about the food industry is that the food industry in particular, because it's a consumable product, it needs to be safe, it needs to be reliable. I mean, everyone needs to eat. It's a much bigger deal if you don't have food than if you don't have a car. The food industry has built itself up upon the need for stability, predictability, and consistency. And when you deal with something like food and like food manufacturing, which has a relatively complex supply chain, which is influenced by weather and transportation and spoilage, etc., then the necessity of creating very fixed processes is clear. So the food industry has created a lot of fixed processes and a lot of fixed way of doing things. It is a high volume and low margin business. So it is created a culture, for very good reason, of wanting to make repeatable process which is not disrupted or changed on short-term notice in order to generate the consistency that's required to be successful. So those are things which are, as I said, exist for very good reason. I think the food industry has executed these things for a good reason and done them very well over time. But there tend to be things which don't work well together with fast paces of change, which is something that digitalization is bringing into the space. The final thing is that the traditional methods of doing the work, of measuring success, of distributing product, of getting the product to the customer, of building a product that the customer likes, they actually work quite well. So it's a highly optimized business. As going back to the quotation from the food chairman I mentioned before, it's done a great job. 50 to 100 years of optimization has done a fantastic job. And then the question is, how does that change and how does that adapt to the new techniques that are coming into this world? So, in order to deal with these things, shall we say, we like to approach relationships, and we like to try to advise our clients to approach, working with us or working with anyone else in a digital setting, with a couple of key steps. And these have to do with how we set up the relationship for success. So, the first thing is stakeholder management, which we'll talk about a bit. The next thing is a dedicated team, having a group of people that is really focused on bringing a new method into the business. The third one, which is critical, is pilots, and so this is really the proof of, or the proof of the pudding, if you want to say. There needs to be some test cases, and there needs to be test cases that are then analyzed, and there needs to be some follow on to that. And then finally, even with successful pilots, even with something that's interesting, that's useful, that drives a lot of value, there still is the change management challenge of rolling out across a large organization. In most cases, at least in our case, we're mostly dealing with large global organizations that use our tools. Okay, so stakeholder engagement. This is usually the first step. It's always the case, particularly in large organizations and particularly in traditional organizations, that there will be what we call champions, people who are very interested in adopting new things or very keen to do that, and then people who are resistant to it. Again, this is a culture which is useful. It's healthy. It makes sure or ensures that the organization is not making any missteps in maintaining that consistent output. So in order to deal with this, what we always look for is that there's a senior leader involved. Usually we deal with a global head, or at least a regional head that has support of global, in order to keep a pilot more regional that can be efficient. But typically we're usually dealing with someone who has the capability and connections to be able to socialize the concept to other parts of the business. The next thing that's important to do is to identify who are the key champions and sources of resistance. So champions, of course, you need people that are interested in the project, you need people that are liking the idea, but it also can be helpful to have the so-called resistors in the group as well. We always look forward to working with people who are skeptical of things that we do. We're always very interested to have our ideas pushed around, and that really helps us to make better. And then the next thing is that you really want to leverage the team and the talent. So don't make a team just full of one type of person. Look at the different cross-functional resources you have and the different talents in a group that you might be interested in taking part in a pilot or an integration, and engage them and spend time doing that. Spend time selecting such a team. The next thing, again going to the team, is that it should be dedicated. So in almost all cases, most companies do not have a cross-functional, multidisciplinary group of people who are only tasked with trying new things. Most companies are more or less organized such that people have roles that are important to the commercial success of the business, and the majority, if not all, or maybe even more than 100% of their time is spent doing that job. And that's the correct way. That's fine. So what's important is that you find and carve out a team of people who are able to dedicate a certain amount of time to working with a new technology or working with a new way of doing the business. The best thing is that when they come from the actual business, so that they've actually worked in it for many years and they know it, and they know what makes it tick. They know the positives and the negatives. They've seen the pain points over years, and these are the people that can really contribute the most to understanding how to fit something new into an organization. In our case, digital AI, machine learning, I can always recommend that you have someone from IT there. Many people, I think, make the mistake that, oh, this is a computer, this is technology, I know how to use email, I can do this. But there are a lot of nuances to integrating a technology or to understanding how a technology company works and delivers its services, which typically people in the IT department have more experience with. So IT, data management people are usually a critical part of a successful stakeholder team. In our case, sensory and consumer insights is a critical component, but it could be that you're working in supply chain or blockchain or some area like that, and then you would want to have people from the logistics area or procurement area involved. Also, in our case, marketing is a key component because, of course, we're in the end trying to drive new business. And then finally, you have to identify, what are the goals? Like, why is the team doing that? The team has to understand that it's not, hey, look, my boss told me to do this. They should really have a key understanding of how to connect the activity to the commercial success or the long-term KPIs of the business. The third step is identifying the actual pilot activity. And this is an area where we've seen um, great ideas coming from the client, and we've seen not so great ideas. It's taken us some experiences to recognize what those ideas are and when they're good and when they're potentially not as good. One thing that we have seen, which we try to caution against, is overreaching. You know, it's fine to have a team or a group of people or a stakeholder that's very excited about the possibilities of a new technology, but even if one can imagine what something can be done or the sort of like long-term stretch of what the world might look like in a year or two or five or 10, you always need to keep in context is that it's an organization of people that are used to doing their work a certain way, and stretching too far will potentially stretch the interest too far as well, and we will lose the connection with the like the core traction of doing something effectively good for the company right at that moment. So selecting the pilot is important. The pilot should have immediate business value. So it should be something, in our case, we always look for something which is not funded by special funds. And some companies do set aside funding to pay for pilots with new technologies that they might not be using all the time, so they're able to sort of engage new things and play with new things. While this seems nice from the outset, and if that's the way that it works, then we're happy to do that as well. But usually when it's being used by the immediate business and being paid for by the immediate business, there is more interest in it because you have more stakeholder engagement, because their personal KPIs are tied to it, the success of the actual outcome of the current business is tied to it. And so this is typically something where we find that there's more engagement from the side of the client. And this is something important to note here, is that the money usually that a company is paying to pilot with a new technology or with a new company, the money, the physical cash that is paid for that is far, far less in terms of value when you compare it to the time that is spent by the stakeholders. Those are paid hours. These people are salaried employees. Those are paid hours. And if you add all of those up, that amount of time, also the potential opportunity cost that they engage in, is much larger than the cost of a pilot. So it's always important that the engagement and time you're spending is bringing immediate value. Right? The second thing is that the deliverable should really be framed with existing practices. Doing something where the deliverable is far out in left field, where it's very different than something that the current team is used to looking at, is always a harder battle. And one of the things, the easiest way to illustrate this is to think a little bit down the road to when you might be presenting the output of the pilot to the head of growth or the CMO or the CEO. And their only interaction with that information is going to be potentially that 30 or 45 minutes that you present the outcomes to them. And if it's very different than what they're used to seeing in their regular working life, the connection and the understanding will be harder to engage with. So try to find deliverable and activity which is close to what you currently do today. Whether it be the format or the activity, something that is close. And then finally, you want to try to understand how you're going to measure it. Is it the measurable thing that, okay, this is faster and less expensive, and therefore it needs to match exactly or close to what we currently do? Is the output that, oh, this is something we never saw before, that is a different angle of understanding our business? So what is the KPI for success? And this is appreciated by everyone involved because they know where to focus. And it's also appreciated by the company that is providing the new service because they also understand how they're going to be evaluated on, and they can understand where to focus. And when you're creating something new that hasn't been done before, there's so many different things that you could do and do well, but you want to focus on the things that is important to do well. Those are the key things about defining what is the pilot. Okay, so the pilot itself should take a reasonable amount of time. Pilots that last for 6 months to a year are usually not the greatest thing. Also, because the provider then may have changes going on in their business that affect the way the pilot is executed. In some cases with some types of technology that's necessary, but there should be at least some milestones or deliverables which are in near term. In our case, near term milestones and deliverables tend to be somewhere between 1 and 4 weeks. We do have pilots that have been going on for effectively 2 years, however. That being said, those pilots have more or less turned into integrations, but it's always a case where we're experimenting and trying new things because new ideas continue to come up. But it's important to have near-term milestones such that the team can actually feel a sense of closure along the way. But after the pilot is finished, you have to have some sort of post-pilot analysis. And a formalized post-pilot analysis is, again, great for everyone. It gives closure to the provider, it gives closure to the team members, it also defines then next steps. When you do this post-pilot analysis, it's important to realize that whatever the outcome was supposed to be, that things may not be exactly perfect the first time around. As with anything that's new, there's a learning process that goes on. There's a technology integration or there's a technology learning process, but then there's also a learning process on behalf of the client and the provider as well of understanding how to work together. And it's as much a test of how do two parties work together and effectively as it is of a specific outcome or technology. So realize that those things may not be perfect right away. The next thing is that keep the information disclosure and the presentation to a small and contained group of stakeholders at first. So don't go present to the CEO and the board of directors, in the very first time that you reveal this information. There will be many points of view from the organization, some resistant, some enthusiastic, some different, some which will cause you to get off topic because it's a tangent of sorts. And you will want to try to explore all of those different angles around that discussion as much as you can within a smaller, intimate group that is more, open-minded, where you can speak openly, where there's a lot of, very comfortable discourse and challenge between the different groups. I encourage this because then it helps to refine the story, and that refinement of the story is what's going to start to determine success about adoption in the wider organization as you go. So really try to kick the tires, if you will, if you want to use those terms, also around the presentation of the information. Get lots of opinions from insiders and outsiders before going into a broader group. And then the other thing is the follow-up. So understand that what are the key follow-ups to every discussion. We've worked with a broad number of companies. I have one company in mind that is the best one that we've worked with so far with respect to this, and it's not saying anything about the business that they run. I'm not going to disclose the name of that company, but they have a very deliberate and very well-oiled manner in which they interact with external service providers that are new. And they always do something which I really appreciate, which is there's always an outcome and a next step from every discussion. There's never a time that you feel that you're not making progress and moving forward. And again, this is motivating for the team on both sides of the fence. And it's really important then to have these kind of consequent next steps. The other thing you have to realize is that these learnings will also age. So doing a pilot and then, because everyone gets busy, 3 or 4 months pass, and then you come back to the pilot. Now that pilot was involved with some sort of project that was critical to the business at that moment. Now that project is not critical to the business anymore because things have changed or moved on. And the whole discussion becomes more contrived. And it's important and useful to try to keep the discussion around the deliverable and around the activity as current and present as possible, because this is what drives engagement and excitement from everybody. And then finally, rollout, right? So rollout is a multi-year thing. You know, many large global organizations aren't just one organization; they're many, right? So there are many different types of things to consider in doing such a rollout. Usually, we have found that the regional teams or the group of people that we have dealt with on a pilot basis are just not aware of some of the things that are required to do a more full-scale rollout of a technology. So this is where having those original stakeholders that I talked about in the first part, where we define the team, this is where their involvement and their historical knowledge will come very much in handy, but also be very critical. So that includes things like, IT again. It includes things like accounts payable and procurement. Like what is the discussion around how, to set up accounts so that different regions can pay a provider? What are the discussions that have to happen with a procurement team, because there might be a particular way that such services are procured, that is different than if you're procuring an ingredient or some other thing that you are used to doing in your business. So understanding how the organization is working is an important point when doing such a rollout. And usually these are what we found taking much, much longer. So the typical pathway for us has been that we would do a pilot. The pilot might lead to even several other pilots in different regions. And then there is a decision to make some sort of initial global rollout. That global rollout usually ends up being a continuation of more pilots, which are adding value to the business, but simply the integration into the commercial infrastructure of the organization is something which can take a long time and may even involve several stakeholders changing jobs. So as a provider, we always look to make sure that we know several people throughout an organization, also because people can change roles. And again, going back to the investment in these types of things, it's not the money really. It's the investment that you make in time, in the employee time spent, in the complication that it might incur in your organization. So the last thing is that if you do something that's kind of half baked and you have a half baked rollout and you don't ever end up getting the full implementation or value from that, but you still have spent all the time and you still created all the confusion of procurement and technology, etc. Well, actually, there's an opportunity cost there. So these things are every step of the way need to be well orchestrated and planned. The other things that is important to a rollout is this is an opportunity to develop standard protocols, right? So how should a service be provided, right? Define this from the top down. Should different regions be allowed to do whatever they want with the technology? Typically, when it comes to data, particularly in our space where it comes to consumer and sensory data, we try to encourage a complete standardization of this information and process as we roll out. It's a place where we think we have a lot of unique leverage in order to make this data more, shall we say, searchable or indexable, because it's all comparable. And the rollout is the place to do that. The pilot, there's a lot of opportunity to change things and experiment and things like that. But once you get into exposing this to the broader organization, you want to try to have some standardization and protocols and training. And then finally, ongoing training. So one thing that's I think very different about technology products versus food products is that food products is the idea is to make them consistent, repeatable, mass producible, dependable, that they're the same year after year after year. Whereas in the digital world, technology is evolving so quickly that these things and these tools often change and improve on even a monthly basis. So having regular check-ins and regular trainings with the team to make sure that they're implementing in a good way is very valuable. So just in summary, just to leave on with a couple of do's and don'ts. The key ones is the first do is if you're doing something new, not just in digital and AI and machine learning, but in general in business, is that involve some key stakeholders. Make sure you have support. Make sure you have a team that's engaged, that knows what they're doing, that really is excited about doing it. Find projects that really bring immediate business value. Like don't make kind of play projects. Make it meaningful and real. It's real money you're spending, and you should get real value from it. Be patient. Be ready to iterate and change things. Be ready to question things that you did before and change them to make them better and improve over time. And then some key don'ts. We don't recommend trying to implement things that are very different than what you do today. It's a repeatable, consistent type of business, the food industry, and we should try to strike a chord with something that is understandable and immediately usable by the existing business. And then finally, like, you should expect that not every person in the organization will be 100% on board. It is nevertheless in innovation, and innovation always has early adopters and later adopters. And the job of the early adopters is to set the process up for success by following some of these techniques, which I outlined before. That's all I have, and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Daniel, for such an informative presentation. So everyone, we're now going to move on to today's Q&A session. And just a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So moving on to our first question. Daniel, what do you think is the biggest potential value for the industry adopting digital and AI methods?
Great. Well, similar to what I mentioned in the presentation, I think that the biggest opportunities in digital and AI for the food industry is standardization, and to continue along the same lines of what they've been doing well for many years, which is like harmonization, standardization, and quality, right? So the food industry in general is still very fragmented, right? Like, we do have a lot of large brand holders in the world. I think everyone knows also about the concentration of the supply chain, but still, like, it's a very local product. It's very driven by local culture. It's very driven by local supply chain and local quality of that product. And I think that driving consistency in the food supply chain is going to become easier with data, because we can measure things, we can measure them better, we can also analyze better to make better decisions. But the other thing is that more challenge is also coming. So we're going to have more difficulties with weather, for example, and keeping supply consistent and dependable for our growing, much growing population in the world. These are all huge challenges for the food supply chain in general. And we're just dealing with consumer data and sensory data. We think there's opportunities there in digital and AI, but certainly in things like blockchain or understanding transparency in the supply chain from the farm all the way through to the consumer. This is really where the processing power and the power of computing, I think, is going to play a really big role in the next century of developing the food industry. And I say the next century because it took almost a century to develop the manufactured food industry that we have now. I think it's going to be that similar journey as we go into the future.
Great, thank you. And I guess, so like leading on from that, do you have examples, or have you used your technology with like the more traditional foods? And let's say that traditional foods are, say, more like fruit and veg, like fresh fruit and veg, meat, that sort of like non-packaged goods.
Yes, we have. So we've done work with supply chain and fruit. So fresh fruit, I can give a couple of examples. Where, for example, like mango, pineapple is being cut and packaged in Ghana, in Africa, and that's then going to be packaged there, and it's going to end up in the shelf in Europe, right? So we actually, because this technology of doing this sensor profiling is so portable with the phone, we've actually done work in quality control in that area. So being able to measure profile throughout the supply chain and how that might be changing, and also how it might be impacting the freshness of the product. So that's more of a quality application. The other thing that we've done is actually in QSR restaurants. So working with restaurants that are serving fresh vegetables and fresh fruits, particularly when they're sourcing it locally. Again, they might have a tomato in their branded restaurant that's coming from 40 different suppliers throughout a country like the United States. And so we've done consumer testing of those fresh fruits and vegetables in the store at the restaurant level to measure quality and consistency, but also then to understand what is the optimal ripeness of a tomato or of a goat cheese. Like how is the taste different at different times of year when the goats might be reproducing and pregnant and things like this. So it's been an interesting journey to see that our tech can pick that up just from regular consumers sitting in the store reviewing some products. And I think it's also a way in which we can start to think about grown products, so products that are natural and grown, in a more shall we say, packaged goods fashion. Like it's really a product, right? Like it's not just something that comes out of the ground and you hope that people like it. We also do work and have clients that are in the indoor growing space. So where they're actually creating seed strains that are going to be optimized for different outputs in indoor growing, so vertical farming. And of course, they're optimizing for things like yield and durability and things like this. But taste is another component of that. And so they use our technology to profile many different samples coming out of their research to optimize, part of the strain of seed for taste. And then they can also use the tool to communicate with the indoor growers who are growing it at their site. The grower at that site can use the app to profile the product, and then they can also have a discussion around maybe changing growing conditions to optimize for that seed. So it pretty much works in fresh products as well. Of course, fresh products, the challenge there is more sometimes understanding from which batch or which growing season or which time of year it came from, but that can also be traced. We've also partnered up with a company called Ripe.io, which is a blockchain company specifically focused on food, to do a couple of these projects, which have been pretty interesting.
That's really fascinating, Daniel. Thank you. And that leads me on nicely to my next question, actually, which is, can you use your data in collaboration with other data sources? So say the more traditional sensory descriptive analysis, or thinking about like the growers you just mentioned, they'll have like different parameters that they will also be measuring. So are you able to combine different sets of data?
Yes. So there's a few ways which we approach that. So the first thing is that the data we collect is proprietary to the client. They are oftentimes using their own flavor language or descriptive language. We just program that into the application. So they can make a combination of our data together with other data that they already have in their database in that way. The other thing is that inside the software, there's a module that is used for traditional sensory panels. It's not nearly as developed as a lot of the core sensory softwares, but the idea there is that we can both take the consumer data using this paired response algorithm, which is, it looks a little bit different, although it's the same information, it looks on an absolute scale a little bit different because we don't know the trained scale. But then we can take the trained panel and have them use also the application both in their traditional way of scaling on the train scale, as well as then doing the pairing. And we can normalize those numbers so that you can combine the new data you're getting from consumer with the old data that you potentially have or continuing to collect with trained panelists. I mean, our output is not as accurate as a fully trained panel, but it's quite close given the reference of cost and speed. So these things always complement each other, and certainly what we're doing is not a replacement for trained panelists, but we're finding that it complements quite well together. That's on the sensory and kind of consumer science data level. But then, as you mentioned, like there's lots of other data out there. Like we oftentimes will work with companies where they're taking their Nielsen data or even their manufacturing data. They're like doing product reviews in store, and then they'll having us collect the dates on the package so that they know what production run it came from. And then they can triangulate that to information that they might have had in their manufacturing process, or maybe even their supply chain, winter wheat, summer wheat, things like this. So there's lots of opportunity to do that. As I mentioned before, we spend a lot of time kind of customizing the output and customizing the setup of the software to support those different types of processes. We don't get involved in doing the analysis around that data combination for a couple of reasons. Number one, the other data is not ours, like it's proprietary, there's a confidentiality issue there. But the other thing is that we really want to be a facilitator to these types of broader analysis, where we really focus on the consumer engagement portion, and then the other portions that might deal with, molecular information or, composition or food matrix, all these other things. Of course, there's other professionals, usually in those food companies, that are focused on that kind of thing. And we want to work together with them to get them the data that they can use to enhance what they're doing, rather than try to recreate all of those things. It wouldn't be practical for us. Plus, there's so much knowledge already in those companies that it makes more sense for them to do that work.
Okay, brilliant. And then just can you just elaborate a little bit more on how you get the how the consumers do the sensory profiling?
Sure. So the way that we get consumer users first, because I see that question also, is that we run these projects and we run our whole consumer kind of engagement like a marketing campaign. So we use a lot of Facebook and Instagram, but then as I mentioned, we get a lot of sharing between friends. So we get about 70% of our users from sharing. And we've seen some of these cases go viral where we have like thousands of people waiting to answer. It depends a bit on the product category. So what happens is the consumer basically gets the product, they go to the store and buy it, or they have it in their home already. And they have to, inside the application, identify the product that they're tasting. So we do that with pictures. And then we also validate things with pictures to make sure that at least physically they have the right product. And then the way that the profiling works with the consumer is it's based on the concept that normal people that are just out in the world, they don't have this language of describing taste and flavor. So they don't really have the vocabulary developed, and they certainly don't understand scale. Like if I asked someone, I don't come from the industry, I mean, I come from the digital space, but I had the idea that we would be able to do this individual profiling for use in actually e-commerce. But, if you ask someone to describe, their coffee on a scale of 1 to 10, the bitterness intensity, they'll give you an answer which means something to them in their kind of frame of reference, but it's an abstract number, really. It's not something that is usable. So what we do instead is, rather than asking them to create a numeric scale or to identify a flavor, we give them a predefined set of attributes, and we give these in pairs. So it's like, which one of these two is stronger? Is it sweet or bitter? Is it, nutty or jammy? Is it et cetera, et cetera? And the algorithm actually is propagating these different questions to the user. And if you can think about the experience a little bit like Tinder of taste, it's, left or right. And what we found is that consumers are able to identify differences between things. Now, they're not able to identify differences uniquely similarly across large populations. Not like 100% of the people will say X, A versus B is the same. But actually, we find that what happens is that you end up with a large distribution of binomial pairs from this gathering of information, which then allowed us to train an algorithm against that distribution and pattern and the way in which they have been answered by the user to try to then match up with what someone who was trained would get. And this is where I say that our output is all relative. It makes it actually comparable. So when you look at like the profile of a chocolate, you see the accurate comparable intensities of the different flavor components, but it may not exactly match numerically what your trained panel is giving you, because your trained panel has a contrived scale, right? They've just been trained on this. But we can actually normalize that to the contrived scale if needed. But for the purpose of like running principal component analysis or Spearman correlation or other drivers of liking analysis, the relative scaling is actually sufficient for us to understand the kind of the consumer space, if you will. So that's a little bit background. Without diagrams and things like that, it may be difficult to engage in.
No, that's brilliant. It's great to just understand how the consumers carry out the evaluation. And I think you also mentioned in there, but to ensure that they're evaluating like the right product, you get them to take a photo of it, or type in some information.
Yeah, they have to take in a consumer study that we're doing, they have to take a photo, and they have to actually take a photo of a purchase receipt. So at least we know that they have purchased the product. And we also measure lots of different behavioral traits of them as a user to see whether or not they're behaving in a kind of a fraudulent or inconsistent manner, looking at things like how long did it take them to screen into the survey versus when they bought the product, versus like how long did it take them to take the study. We look at IP address and browser address, and we're basically tracking their behavior, which is very similar to what e-commerce companies do to also try to understand when you might have fraudulent actors. But the other key thing that we do when we screen people in is we actually have a portfolio of information on lots of different products in the market, and we make people profile products that we already know the profile of. So we understand already very quickly, before they're even participating in any of these things, how accurate they are and how good they are at doing this. Of course, we also understand their intent, whether or not they're just doing this randomly. And then, of course, as they're participating in a study, say they're profiling chocolate or a drink or something like this, we understand the group profile. And if we see that the answer set that's being given by a particular person from these binary pairs, which is actually too complicated for them to guess, if we see this pattern falls too far outside what would be an expected normal distribution of mistakes, because again, like not every user is going to make every pair selection the same, we will throw that response out. So if someone is tasting a product and they're not actually tasting that product at that moment, there would be no way for them to answer in a way which would be consistent with the actual profile of the product, and we would throw that response out.
Okay, that's really great to hear. And that also leads me nicely onto this next question. But how do you become a FlavorWiki consumer or product taster?
So anyone can join. As I said, we do a lot of marketing online, Facebook, Instagram engagement, and then we see a lot of people are doing sharing, like they share with their friends. And people are interested in discovering products. They're interested in participating in these types of experiences to find new products that they might like. And usually it's coming through social. But we run it like an online marketing campaign. It's quite similar to that. That's usually how it works. But one thing I should say is that we do try to filter out people that work in the food industry.
Yeah, I imagine so.
Yeah, so sometimes, like that might happen.
We might get a reject.
Yeah, and actually we try more and more now not to reject people, because what we found is that consumers are actually very interested in doing this type of thing. And they actually get very upset when they get screened out because they're not in the right demographic group. So what we've started to do now more and more is to just allow everyone to answer, but then we adjust the incentive scheme correctly, because we're obviously not so interested in some, but we are interested in others. But it's better from the point of view of developing the community to just let everybody answer, right?
That's great. And what is the optimal number of respondents that you have for one of your studies? So what is the recommended number of participants?
So we do have a way of measuring statistical significance between the sensoric measurements, right? So we are able to apply a way of doing a simulation, so we can do like a Fisher or Tukey analysis against the different attribute separations. And that is usually the thing which determines the minimum number of consumer testers we would need for a product. Typically, for somewhere between 6 and 12 attributes in a flavor profile or a texture profile, it'll be between 20 and 40 people before we reach that significance. But usually, if we're doing a project that is involved with also hedonic understanding, it's the kind of standard between 100 and 200 responses on a product in order to get significance. But that's in cases where we do a project and it's like, okay, this takes 3 weeks, we collect the data and then we move on. We start more and more now to do more what we call longitudinal or long-term projects, where we actually just start the collection of data on a particular category, and then we collect like 150 responses every month, right? Because it becomes very cost effective to do this once it's running. And then the significance is really a question of like, okay, do we want significance on a 60-day moving average or on a 30-day moving average, or what is the question to answer? So it really varies in terms of what is the problem we're trying to solve for, or what is the information we're trying to get. Also, of course, there's some optimization there around budget of the client.
Okay. So you spoke about like the challenges that you could sometimes face with implementing a new technology into a company, and that most people are afraid of being replaced by technology. So how do you see it as being possible to overcome this challenge? What are some of your additional tips?
The way we like to approach, it's a great question. I think this is true in almost every industry. Like every place you look, innovation and change has this challenge. The way that we look at it, and the way that we try to also format a healthy relationship with the customer, is to help them realize that we're not sensory scientists, right? Actually, like I have a data background in commodity trading, and then I was in the e-commerce industry, and we have worked really closely with different flavor houses. We have some people in the team now that are obviously long professionals in doing this, but our goal is actually to facilitate the collection of more data, the analysis of this information, and then also to a large degree the innovation around how it can be used. This is where we going back to that digital partner role, right? Like we try to make this very clear to everyone we deal with that that's the relationship we look for. Like we've even kind of turned down some clients because they just sort of like, oh, we just need this data and we want to move on. We actually really look for how can we make the most impact on moving the industry forward by leveraging the talent that is in many of these client companies. And I'm sure like the vast majority of sensory and consumer insights knowledge is either in universities or in large food companies. Small and medium-sized food companies tend to not be as well equipped in this area. So we really see these things as symbiotic, and therefore we see that it may be that the role of some people in these industries or these functions will change over time. I think it will become more data-driven, more computer-driven, but the interpretation of it still requires like building the bridge between those many decades of research and proven process and what can be done now.
Cool. You mentioned that digitization is becoming the norm, like it is the way that things are moving. So how can someone learn AI in order to be a part of this story? What are your recommendations?
So maybe I can just speak about an experiences we've had. We've seen that people that are, this may sound, well, it sounds the way it sounds. People that are younger and maybe have been through university more recently, they tend to be more computer aware, right? It also is the case for me. I'm 44 and I'm less computer aware than the people that work for me actually. So I think that if you're in university, you can try to expose yourself more to some of these techniques and then try to understand how you can apply your own field to them. If you're already in the working world, there's lots and lots of information available online and like tutorials and things like this. But the other thing is that, to really, I think, start simple and try to learn through some basic cases and some basic instruction and just learn how to talk about it, how to think about it. And I think at least for our approach, it's not too far of a step, right? Like we definitely don't talk about predicting the future of the world, right? Like this is a very complex thing to do. It's hard to do it. So we try to take like simple steps, be like, look, this is what we're currently doing today. What can we do with digital tools? It'll just make it a little bit easier, right? Let's start there. And then in the process of doing those projects, the process of implementing that type of a method, the whole team starts to learn more and more and become more aware of it. And I think that there is a lot of consultation out there as well. I think you're going to see more people that specialize in simply helping companies make these transformations. So those are things I can recommend to do. It's not something to be afraid of. That's the other thing. Like it's totally understandable. Frankly, I think sensory science and consumer science is a lot more complex than digital. And I'm coming at that from it as a newcomer.
Okay, well, great. We're out of time now. So thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you to everyone from across the globe for attending the webinar today. If we didn't manage to answer your questions, please contact our speaker directly. Their details are on the screen now. Finally, we would like to remind those of you not familiar with the IFST that you can find useful resources on our website, including our COVID-19 Knowledge Hub and online Food Science and Technology magazine. We welcome new members, so please check our membership benefits page on the IFST website. Thank you again, Daniel, and thank you all for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you.